The sun had only just begun its steady climb over the horizon when Henry Carter pushed open the glass door of Mabel's diner, the kind of place that smelled like fried eggs, bacon grease, and nostalgia. A brass bell chimed above the door, not in a loud clatter but in a soft, familiar ring that let the handful of early customers know someone had joined them. Henry stepped inside, leaning slightly on his polished wooden cane, his shoulders still broad despite the years that had bent his back. At 81, he moved slower than he once had, but each step was deliberate, steady, dignified. He wore a pressed shirt, tucked neatly into his trousers, and a cap embroidered with faded military insignia. The hat alone told a story, one of battlefields far away, medals tucked in drawers, and years of service that few in the diner could fully comprehend. "Morning, Henry," called out Nancy, the waitress on duty, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun, her voice warm as coffee. Henry nodded, offering a smile that barely lifted the corners of his mouth but carried a weight of sincerity. "Morning, Nancy. You're up early." "Early bird gets the worm," she teased, refilling a trucker's mug before gliding toward Henry. "Usual spot." Henry tapped his cane lightly against the counter and lowered himself onto a stool near the window. The vinyl seat creaked under him, though it wasn't as loud as the bones in his knees. He set his cap on the counter with quiet reverence, like a man placing down a piece of his soul. Nancy poured his black coffee without asking, 2 sugars, no cream. "There you go, Sergeant." She still called him by rank, though he hadn't worn the uniform in decades. He thanked her softly, wrapping both hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his weathered fingers. Outside, the town was just waking up. Delivery trucks rumbled by, shopkeepers lifted shutters, and a boy on a bicycle zipped past with a newspaper bag slung over his shoulder. Henry's gaze lingered on the street for a moment, then shifted back to the diner. It was a room he knew well, red booths lining the walls, photographs of local baseball teams from 20 years ago, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't been updated since the late 80s. It was comfort. It was routine. Around him, life unfolded in little fragments. A pair of mechanics in grease-stained coveralls debated whether the Yankees had a chance this season. An elderly couple in a booth shared a plate of pancakes, their hands brushing together as naturally as breathing. A young mother fed bits of toast to her toddler, who laughed every time syrup dripped onto his bib. For Henry, mornings like this were reminders of why he had served. The everyday piece of ordinary people, that was worth every scar he carried inside. Nancy brought his breakfast, scrambled eggs, bacon crisped just right, wheat toast with a sliver of butter melting in the middle. He thanked her again and bowed his head briefly, whispering a grace no one else could hear. As he ate, memories flickered uninvited. Not all of them were kind. He remembered desert winds stinging his eyes, the thunder of artillery in jungles, the silence after men fell. He remembered comrades who never came home, their names etched on monuments while he lived on, carrying them with him. He took a sip of coffee, chasing away the ghosts. A voice from across the diner broke his reverie. "Mr. Carter, you still fixing radios?" asked Tommy Miller, the teenage dishwasher, his apron too big for his skinny frame. Henry chuckled low. "Only when they're worth fixing. Most folks throw things away too easy these days." Tommy grinned, his teeth slightly crooked, and vanished back through the swinging kitchen door. Henry's eyes softened. The boy reminded him of his grandson, quick, eager, still unshaped by life's cruelties. The clock above the register ticked closer to 8. The diner grew a little louder as more townsfolk trickled in, the morning rhythm picking up. Yet, through the chatter and clatter of dishes, Henry remained a quiet anchor, sipping his coffee, observing, listening. He had learned long ago that silence often said more than words. Nancy leaned over the counter, lowering her voice. "You hear about that new fella back in town? Derek Malloy." Henry's brow furrowed faintly. The name carried an echo. His father had been a mean drunk, notorious years ago. Henry had once broken up a bar fight involving the old man. "Sons know better," Nancy continued. "He's already caused a scene at the gas station. Thinks he owns the place." Henry didn't comment. He had no use for gossip, but he filed the name away like a soldier noting a potential threat. He cut into his bacon with deliberate slowness, chewing thoughtfully. In the stillness of his manner, there was strength, an unspoken warning to anyone who cared enough to notice. The bell above the diner door jingled again, sharper this time, slicing through the hum of morning calm. A gust of cold air swept in with the newcomer. Henry lifted his eyes. A tall figure stepped inside, broad-shouldered, chest puffed out, swagger in every step. His leather jacket squeaked as he moved, his boots heavy against the tile. His smirk was already in place, like armor against the world. Derek Malloy. Nancy stiffened behind the counter. The mechanics paused mid-argument. Even the toddler stopped laughing, as if sensing the air had shifted. Henry Carter didn't move. He simply sipped his coffee, his weathered hands steady, his gaze locked onto the man now filling the doorway. The quiet morning had ended. The battle was about to begin. The bell above the door still echoed faintly when Derek Malloy swaggered into Mabel's diner like a storm cloud that refused to pass. He wasn't just entering a room, he was staking a claim. His boot struck the tile floor with a deliberate heaviness, each step louder than the last, as if daring someone to tell him to quiet down. His leather jacket, too shiny to be old and too scuffed to be new, squeaked as he threw his arms wide in a theatrical stretch. "Well, well, well," Derek's voice boomed, dripping with arrogance. "If it isn't the same old crowd in the same old dump." The chatter inside the diner faltered. A few customers lowered their eyes, not wanting to attract his attention. Others stiffened, silent but bristling. Derek had a reputation, loud at bars, quick with insults, and quicker with fists. Nancy, standing behind the counter with her coffee pot, forced a thin smile. "Morning, Derek." "Coffee? Coffee?" He scoffed, sliding onto a stool 2 seats away from Henry, slamming his palms against the counter. "You think I came here for your dishwater coffee? Nah. I came here because I like watching people squirm." He smirked, eyes scanning the room like a predator choosing which rabbit to chase. Henry Carter didn't turn. He kept his gaze fixed on the window, calmly sipping his coffee, the steaming mug steady in his hand. But Derek noticed him. "Look at this," Derek sneered, leaning sideways to get a better view of Henry's face. "An old man sittin' here like he owns the place. You're nothin' but a relic, Grandpa." The room tensed. The mechanics glanced at each other. The young mother pulled her child closer. Tommy peeked through the kitchen door, worry in his eyes. Henry set his coffee mug down with quiet precision, his movements unhurried. He turned his head slowly, meeting Derek's eyes with a gaze so steady, so unflinching, that it momentarily disarmed the younger man. "Good morning," Henry said simply. His voice was calm, measured, a river flowing over stones. Derek's smirk faltered for a second, but arrogance quickly reassembled itself. "That's all you got? Good morning. Don't you know who I am?" Henry's brow lifted faintly. "You're a man who just walked into a diner. The quiet confidence in his tone struck Derek harder than any insult could have. Derek's jaw tightened. He leaned closer, his breath laced with last night's whiskey. "You think you're better than me, old man? Sitting there with your cane, your fancy hat, pretending you matter." Henry didn't flinch. He simply said, "I serve this country. That's what matters." A murmur ran through the diner. The mechanics shifted in their seats, the elderly couple looked up from their pancakes, and even Nancy froze mid-pour. Everyone knew Henry's history, at least in pieces. They knew he had fought in wars most only read about. But Derek wasn't impressed. He barked a laugh, the sound sharp and ugly. "Serve this country? Don't make me laugh. What did you do, polish boots? Carry water? You're nothing now. Just an old fool waitin' to die." Nancy's eyes flared, but Henry gave her a slight shake of his head, wordlessly asking her not to intervene. His composure was unshakable. Henry's voice was quiet, but it cut through Derek's laughter like a knife. "I carried men off battlefields you wouldn't last 5 minutes on." The silence that followed was heavy. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on everyone in the diner. Derek's smirk wavered again, but pride wouldn't let him back down. He slammed his hand on the counter, making the mugs rattle. "Don't talk back to me, old man. You think wearing that stupid hat makes you tough?" Henry calmly reached for his bacon, took a bite, and chewed deliberately. He didn't give Derek the satisfaction of reacting. Derek's face flushed. His voice grew louder, sharper. "You're nothing but a washed-up has-been. People. Like you should learn their place." Henry set his fork down gently, turned his full attention toward Derek, and said, "My place was on the front line when this country needed me. Where was yours?" The words hit harder than Derek expected. For a heartbeat, he was speechless, caught in the steel of Henry's gaze. Around them, the diner's patrons shifted uneasily, their loyalty clearly siding with Henry, though fear kept them silent. Derek leaned back, masking his shaken pride with mockery. "Oh, listen to the hero. You think anyone cares about your stories? This is my town now. My rules." Henry took another sip of coffee, unbothered. "Bullies always think that." That single word, bullies, landed with the weight of a gavel. Derek had been called many things in his life, but in front of an audience, being labeled a bully by a man twice his age cut deeper than he let on. His fists clenched. His jaw locked. The waitress moved subtly closer to the phone behind the counter, ready to call the sheriff if things escalated. The young mother whispered softly to her child, distracting him with a toy spoon. But Derek was too far gone. His pride demanded a show of dominance. He leaned so close that his nose nearly brushed Henry's ear. "Careful, old man. Keep talking like that, and I'll make sure you can't get up from that stool." Henry didn't blink. "Do what you feel you need to. But remember this, some battles end the moment they start." The words, soft and deliberate, chilled the air around them. Derek sneered, frustrated that every attempt to rattle Henry had only made himself look smaller. He needed to act. He needed to prove control. And so, with a sudden, sharp motion, Derek's hand whipped across the counter and slapped Henry across the face. The sound cracked through the diner like a gunshot. Cups rattled. Plates clattered. Nancy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The toddler whimpered at the sudden noise. Henry's head turned slightly with the impact, but when he looked back at Derek, his eyes were steady, burning with quiet fire. The veteran didn't shout. He didn't rise. He simply said, loud enough for all to hear. "You don't know who you just touched." The sound of Derek Malloy's slap still echoed in the small diner like thunder trapped in four walls. The air hung heavy, brittle with shock. Every eye in the room was fixed on the counter, where the young bully stood with a smirk curling on his lips and the old veteran sat unmoving, his cheek faintly reddened. Henry Carter did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned his head back toward Derek, his gaze steady, his eyes carrying the weight of wars fought and sacrifices made. The steadiness unsettled Derek more than any fist could have. "You don't know who you just touched," Henry repeated, his voice calm, low, and resonant. For a moment, silence reigned. The waitress Nancy's hand hovered near the phone. The mechanics at the booth clenched their fists under the table, whispering to each other, torn between stepping in and fearing Derek's violent reputation. The young mother tightened her arms around her child, rocking him gently, shielding his eyes from the ugliness unfolding. Derek barked out a laugh that sounded too loud, too forced. "Oh, I don't know who I touched. Old man, you're just a bag of bones. You're nothing. You're nobody." Henry's hand remained steady on his coffee mug. His fingers, though weathered and lined with age, did not shake. He lifted the mug, took a measured sip, and set it down with precision. "You'll learn soon enough," he said. Derek's face twisted. He was losing ground, and he knew it. The crowd wasn't laughing with him. They were watching, waiting, silently condemning. His slap had not produced fear or submission, it had only highlighted Henry's unyielding strength. So Derek escalated. He grabbed Henry's cap from the counter, the faded cap with military insignia, worn with pride through decades. With a sneer, Derek tossed it to the floor and stomped his boot onto it, grinding the brim against the dirty tile. "Is this your precious glory, huh? Your big war trophy?" Derek taunted. "Look at it now." A gasp rippled through the diner. Even those who feared Derek felt the sting of his disrespect. The mechanics pushed back their chairs, ready to rise. Nancy's voice trembled, "Derek, that's enough." Henry's eyes flickered to the crushed cap, but he made no move to retrieve it. Instead, he fixed his gaze on Derek with such quiet authority that the bully faltered again, if only for a heartbeat. "Boots like yours," Henry said evenly, "aren't fit to touch the dirt those men died on." Derek's hand shot forward, gripping Henry by the collar. The sudden motion jolted the diner, silverware clinking, a baby crying softly. Derek pulled the old man closer, their faces inches apart, his breath hot with rage. "You think you can disrespect me in my own town?" Derek spat. Henry's voice was so calm it was chilling. "I don't need to disrespect you. You've already done that yourself." The bully's knuckles whitened as his grip tightened, but Henry remained motionless, his eyes like iron. The stillness, the refusal to be rattled, was a force Derek couldn't comprehend. "Let him go," Nancy shouted from behind the counter. Her voice cracked but carried across the diner. The mechanics stood halfway out of their booth now, their chairs scraping. Tommy, the dishwasher, peeked out again, his young eyes wide with fear but also awe. And then Henry did something unexpected. He didn't raise his hands in defense. He didn't strike back. Instead, he leaned closer, whispering in Derek's ear with words only he could hear. "You picked the wrong man. And soon, you'll wish you hadn't." Derek froze for half a second, unsure why a whisper felt more dangerous than a punch. He released Henry abruptly, shoving him back against the stool, as if to reassert control. "You talk big for someone who can barely walk," Derek snarled. Henry adjusted his collar, smoothed it down, and sat upright again, his composure unbroken. "I don't need to walk fast. Some things come to me." The line puzzled Derek, but the way Henry spoke it, measured, prophetic, gnawed at the edges of his bravado. One of the mechanics finally stepped forward. "Malloy, that's enough. Leave the man be." Derek spun on him, eyes blazing. "You gonna stop me? You think anyone here can?" He spread his arms wide, his voice rising, echoing against the diner's walls. "This is my town. I do what I want, to who I want." The declaration rang out, but instead of intimidating the crowd, it only deepened their silent disgust. The young mother covered her child's ears. The elderly couple clutched hands tighter. Tommy muttered under his breath, "Not for long." Henry bent slowly, picked up his cap from the floor, dusted it gently, and set it back on his head. The act, simple and deliberate, carried more dignity than Derek could ever muster. "You mistake fear for respect," Henry said softly, his voice carrying through the hush. "One is demanded. The other is earned. And men like you never earn it." The bully's face burned crimson, a vein throbbing at his temple. He raised his fist, ready to strike again, but hesitated. Something about Henry's calm, the unflinching certainty in his tone, made the act feel futile. For the first time, Derek felt an unfamiliar flicker of unease. To mask it, he puffed out his chest, turned to the diner, and shouted, "See this? This is what happens when someone doesn't know his place." No one cheered. No one nodded. The silence that answered him was more condemning than words. Henry took another sip of coffee, unhurried. Then, setting the mug down gently, he pulled an old flip phone from his pocket. He flipped it open, the click loud in the quiet diner. "Michael," Henry said into the phone, his voice steady, clear, and without hesitation. "It's time. Come to Mabel's." The room froze. Derek frowned, confused. "Who the hell you calling?" Henry closed the phone with a snap, placed it back in his pocket, and leaned back slightly on his stool. His eyes never left Derek's. "You'll see," Henry said. The silence that followed was heavier than before, every soul in the diner holding its breath, waiting for the storm that was clearly about to break. Derek, his bravado fraying, forced another laugh, though it rang hollow. "What, your grandson gonna come beat me up?" Henry didn't answer. He didn't need to. His composure said more than words ever could. For the first time that morning, Derek Malloy looked around and realized something. The room was no longer laughing with him. The room wasn't laughing at all. And he, for all his swagger, was suddenly the smallest man in it. The diner had grown so quiet after Henry's phone call that the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded like a drumbeat. Derek Malloy stood there, chest heaving, his swagger cracking around the edges, while Henry Carter remained still, his flip phone tucked back into his pocket. It was no longer just a confrontation between two men. The whole diner had become an audience, unwilling participants in a moment they knew would ripple far beyond these four walls. The teen with the phone. In the booth near the back, a teenager named Ethan Caldwell sat frozen, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. At first, he had pulled it out just to sneak a video, a habit drilled into his generation, record everything, share later. But as Derek slapped the old veteran, Ethan's shaky hands had steadied. He realized he wasn't just recording for entertainment. He was recording for evidence. The red circle of "wreck" blinked on the screen, capturing every detail: the arrogance in Derek's sneer, the dignity in Henry's silence, the crushed cap beneath a boot, the whispered phone call that changed the atmosphere entirely. Ethan zoomed in slightly, focusing on Henry's calm expression, the kind of strength you couldn't fake. "Gettin' all this?" whispered his friend across the booth, eyes wide. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. "The whole thing." For the first time, Derek's power seemed to shrink. He hadn't realized the world outside this diner might soon see what he had done. The young mother. At the corner booth, Marissa Green tried to distract her toddler with crayons and sugar packets. She had thought breakfast here would be a safe start to their morning. Instead, she now sat inches from violence. Her little boy kept asking questions in his innocent voice. "Why's that man so mad, Mommy? Why did he hit the grandpa?" Marissa's throat tightened. She kissed the top of his head. And whispered, "Some people don't know how to be kind." But her heart thudded as she looked around. She saw the way everyone else watched, afraid yet transfixed. She knew her son would remember this moment. What kind of lesson would it leave? Her eyes drifted back to Henry. Despite the slap, despite the insult, he sat upright, strong, composed. She realized the lesson wasn't in Derek's cruelty, it was in Henry's resilience. The mechanics. The two mechanics, Joe Ramirez and Kyle Bennett, were no strangers to Derek Malloy. They had seen him swagger into bars, run his mouth, and throw fists when he had too much to drink. But seeing him pick on Henry Carter stirred something different. Joe muttered under his breath, "That ain't a man. That's a coward." Kyle's fists clenched on the table. "We should stop him." But Joe shook his head. "Not yet. Watch Carter. He's got this." Indeed, Henry's composure was a strategy in itself. He wasn't engaging with anger, he was allowing Derek to bury himself deeper, every word and action witnessed, catalogued, remembered. Nancy, the waitress. Behind the counter, Nancy's knuckles whitened around the coffee pot. She had seen men lose their tempers before, but never in this way, never against someone who had done so much for the community. Henry had always been polite, always tipped generously, always asked about her kids. He deserved respect. She glanced at the phone near the register, wondering if she should call the sheriff. But then she remembered, Sheriff Barnes had grown up with Derek. Rumor had it, Barnes still owed the Malloy family more than a few favors. Would he even respond? Would he take Henry's side? Her eyes moved to Henry, searching his calm face for direction. He gave the faintest shake of his head again. It was his way of saying, "Wait. Don't act yet." And she obeyed. Derek's faltering grip. Derek, oblivious to the shifting mood, puffed his chest and turned back toward Henry. "What's the matter, old man? You gonna let your phone do the fighting for you? Call your grandson. Call the cops. Nobody's gonna save you here." His voice was loud, but cracks showed in his performance. His eyes flicked nervously toward the teenager's phone. He noticed the unwavering glares of the other patrons. For the first time, he sensed the weight of witnesses pressing down on him. Henry set his coffee mug down with that same deliberate calm. "I don't need saving," he said softly. "I've stood alone before. But you've never stood for anything." The line hit Derek like a slap of its own. He snarled, but his bravado felt thinner now. The gathering storm. The diner had become something more than a breakfast stop. It was a courtroom without walls. Every patron was a juror, silently weighing Henry's quiet dignity against Derek's loud cruelty. Every second that passed etched the truth deeper: Henry was a man of honor. Derek was a man of emptiness. Ethan's phone kept recording, its camera unblinking. Marissa's child scribbled absent-minded lines on a napkin, while his mother's gaze never left Henry. The mechanics braced for action if needed. Nancy kept the coffee pot ready like a shield. The diner was no longer neutral ground. It belonged to Henry now, though he had claimed it with silence, not fists. Derek's last push. Desperate to regain control, Derek raised his voice to the crowd. "What, you all think he's some kind of hero? He's just an old man clinging to the past. You think he's special? He's nobody." But even as the words left his mouth, Derek realized he was alone. Not a single nod of agreement. Not a single laugh. Just silence, thick and suffocating. Henry looked around the diner slowly, meeting the eyes of every patron, acknowledging them without words. Then he returned his gaze to Derek. "Heroes don't call themselves that," Henry said. "They don't need to. Others remember for them." The crowd shifted, the weight of truth sinking in. The warning. Derek, cornered by his own performance, slammed his fist on the counter again. "I'll." But Henry cut him off, his voice firm, his words crisp. "Be careful what you do next. Every soul in this room has already seen enough. And soon, the whole world will." His eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan's phone. Derek followed the glance, saw the glowing screen, and his stomach twisted. For the first time, Derek realized he wasn't in control. The witnesses unite. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't an uprising. It was subtler, stronger. The mechanics stood up fully, crossing their arms. The elderly couple turned in their booth, their disapproving stares sharp. Nancy set down the coffee pot and folded her arms across her apron. Marissa clutched her child and lifted her chin in quiet defiance. Even Tommy, the boy in the kitchen, stepped forward, dish rag still in hand, eyes locked on Derek with a bravery he hadn't known he had. The diner, united, bore down on Derek Malloy, not with fists, not with violence, but with the undeniable power of collective judgment. Derek looked around, his swagger faltering, his voice caught in his throat. Henry Carter, calm as ever, adjusted his cap and said, "See? You're outnumbered, Derek. Not by strength, but by truth." The diner hummed with the weight of it. The witnesses had chosen their side. The diner was heavy with silence, each second dragging like a weight across the room. Derek Malloy stood by the counter, fists trembling with fury, but his voice had faltered. He had felt it, that strange shift in power when Henry Carter, with a steady hand and an unflinching gaze, flipped open that old phone and spoke into it. Just one sentence. Just a name. "Michael, it's time. Come to Mabel's." The words replayed in Derek's head like a drumbeat. He didn't understand why they unnerved him. He didn't even know who Michael was. But the way Henry had said it, calm, certain, like a general issuing an order, made the younger man's chest tighten. Derek shook it off and forced out a laugh, though it came too loud, too sharp, betraying his unease. "What was that? Calling your bingo buddy? Or maybe your doctor? You think anyone cares if you fall off that stool?" Henry didn't answer. He didn't need to. He adjusted his cap, smoothed his shirt collar, and sipped his coffee. The simplicity of the act rattled Derek more than any insult could. The diner holds its breath. The witnesses watched in silence, their eyes flicking between Henry and Derek. Ethan, the teenager, kept his phone steady, recording every second. His pulse raced, but his hands were calm, as if he knew this moment would matter far beyond the walls of Mabel's diner. Marissa, the young mother, bounced her child gently, whispering soothing words, though her own heart pounded. Nancy, behind the counter, gripped the coffee pot so hard her knuckles ached, waiting for Henry to give some sign, any sign, that it was time to call the sheriff. But Henry gave no such signal. He seemed content to wait. And waiting, Derek realized, was worse than shouting. Derek's desperation. Unable to bear the silence, Derek shoved his hand toward Henry again, but the old man didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't even raise his cane. "Who the hell do you think you're scaring?" Derek spat, his voice pitched higher than before. "You think I'm supposed to be impressed by some name? Michael? Who's Michael? Huh? Your grandson? Some old war buddy limping over here with a cane too?" His words were sharp, but his laughter was hollow. Derek knew it. Everyone in the diner knew it. Henry's eyes narrowed, not with anger but with something colder. He set his mug down, leaned slightly forward, and said, "Michael Carter is my son." The name landed in the air with weight, like a stone dropped in a still pond. A few of the older patrons exchanged glances. They had heard that name before, though not in small-town gossip. It had come up in the news, in whispers about security, politics, and power. Derek blinked, confused. "Your son. So what?" Henry didn't elaborate. He simply sat back, his silence daring Derek to fill in the gaps. "Rumors begin." Nancy's brow furrowed. "Michael Carter," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. The mechanics overheard, leaning closer. "Ain't that the guy?" Joe's voice dropped to a murmur. "Head of something in Washington. Homeland Security or some high-up position like that." Kyle's eyes widened. "No kidding." Word spread through the diner in hushed tones. Some had heard of him, some hadn't, but the weight of the possibility shifted the air. Meanwhile, Derek scoffed, desperate to maintain control. "Homeland Security? Please. You think I'm dumb enough to believe some washed-up vet's son is out there running the country's safety? You're full of it." But Derek's eyes darted toward the window, as if half expecting black cars to roll up already. Henry's calm warning. Henry adjusted his cap again, his weathered fingers smoothing the brim. His voice was soft, but it carried through the diner. "Derek, I've fought men who believed they were invincible. Men who thought the world belonged to them. They always fall the hardest. You've crossed a line you can't uncross. And when that door opens again, you'll wish you had walked out while you could." The words chilled Derek to his bones. He masked it with bravado, leaning closer, smirking. "You talk a lot for someone who just got smacked around." Henry's eyes didn't waver. "And yet, here I sit. And there you stand, sweating." A ripple of uneasy laughter stirred among the patrons, not amusement at Henry's words, but recognition of their truth. Derek's face flushed crimson. The wait. The minutes crawled by. Outside, life went on, delivery trucks passed, the boy on his bicycle rode another lap with newspapers, the town stirred awake. But inside Mabel's, time felt suspended. Every clink of a fork, every shuffle of feet was magnified. The witnesses barely touched their food. Ethan's camera kept rolling, capturing not just the confrontation but the oppressive stillness that followed Henry's phone call. Derek paced near the counter like a caged animal. He muttered curses under his breath, shot glares at the patrons, even kicked at a chair. Yet no one rose to challenge him. They didn't need to. They were waiting too. Waiting to see if the name, Michael, carried the weight Henry promised it did. Derek's mockery. Trying to reclaim the upper hand, Derek leaned close to Ethan, who sat in his booth with his phone. "You better delete that," Derek growled. "Nobody wants to see your shaky little video. If I catch that online, I'll..." Ethan's friend whispered, "It's live, man. People are already watching." Derek's stomach lurched. He snapped his head back to Henry. "You think this little stunt's gonna scare me? You think I care if people see me rough up an old man? They'll cheer me. They'll say he deserved it." But his voice wavered on the last words, and everyone noticed. Henry's reply was slow, deliberate. "The world doesn't cheer bullies. They expose them." The shift in the room. The witnesses, silent until now, began to stir. Marissa, the young mother, spoke up, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "Leave him alone, Derek. You've already done enough." The mechanics stepped forward from their booth, arms crossed. Joe's voice was firm, "He's right. You're done here." Nancy set down her coffee pot, her apron stained, her face resolute. "You ought to walk out while you still can, Derek. Before someone bigger than you gets here." The words weren't shouted, but they gathered like a tide. For the first time, Derek saw not a frightened crowd but a room united. And he was the only man standing on the wrong side of it. The distant sound. Then it came, the faint hum of engines outside. Deep, low, controlled. Not the rattle of pickup trucks, not the sputter of local cars. This was different. Derek's head whipped toward the window. Black SUVs rolled slowly down the street, their tinted windows catching the morning sun. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. They moved with purpose, with authority. The diner patrons leaned forward, whispers breaking into nervous anticipation. Henry took his last sip of coffee, set the mug down, and said softly, "It's time." The final beat. Derek stumbled back a step, his bravado crumbling. His voice cracked as he tried to shout, This is some kind of trick." But no one believed him anymore. Not even himself. The sound of the diner door opening again filled the room. Cold air swept in, along with polished shoes and dark suits. The presence that entered carried weight far greater than Derek's swagger ever could. And at the front of them all was Michael Carter, head of Homeland Security, his expression unreadable, his eyes immediately locking onto his father. Henry smiled faintly, the kind of smile only a father gives his son. "You took your time." The bell above the diner door jingled again, but this time it didn't sound like an ordinary customer stepping inside. It sounded like a verdict. The faint rush of cold morning air swept in, carrying with it a presence that silenced the diner even further, as though the building itself had drawn in a breath. 3 men in dark suits entered first, their movements sharp, disciplined, efficient. Their eyes scanned the room with a precision that belonged to professionals, not locals. Sunglasses were removed, earpieces glinted faintly, and hands hovered near jackets heavy with the unmistakable bulge of concealed weapons. Behind them stepped a figure who seemed to carry the weight of the entire room without saying a word, Michael Carter. He was tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit. His posture radiated command, his every step was deliberate, controlled, the kind of stride that belonged to a man accustomed to walking into rooms of crisis and bending them to his will. But it wasn't the suit, or the detail, or even the presence of authority that made the air shift. It was the eyes, sharp, assessing, burning with restrained fury as they landed on the sight before him, his father seated at the counter, his cheek reddened, his cap dusty on his head, and a stranger looming near him. Henry Carter smiled faintly at the sight of his son. His hand lifted in a small, almost imperceptible gesture, one of recognition, one of pride. "You took your time," he said softly. Michael's jaw tightened. "Traffic," he replied, his voice calm but edged with steel. The diner's patrons, who had already been silent witnesses to the earlier confrontation, now sat frozen. The sight of men in suits, the black SUVs outside, and Michael Carter himself stepping into their small-town diner was surreal. Whispers fluttered through the booths, "That's him, that's Henry's boy." Homeland Security. Derek's confusion. Derek Malloy blinked rapidly, struggling to piece together what he was seeing. He puffed his chest, forcing bravado into his stance, but sweat had already gathered at his hairline. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" Derek demanded, though his voice cracked slightly. Michael didn't answer right away. He moved forward with slow, deliberate steps until he stood directly between Derek and his father. He placed one hand lightly on Henry's shoulder, the gesture protective yet respectful. Then he turned his gaze on Derek. "I am Michael Carter," he said evenly. "Director of Homeland Security. And that is my father you laid your hands on." The words landed like thunder. The diner seemed to shrink. Derek's smirk collapsed into something fragile, brittle, false. His eyes darted from Michael to the agents flanking him, to the crowd of witnesses now emboldened by the truth of who sat among them. You're lying," Derek stammered. "This is some kind of stunt." Michael's gaze didn't waver. "Son, when I lie, entire nations listen. And you're not worth the effort." The crowd reacts. Ethan, still recording, zoomed in with his phone. His hands trembled not with fear this time but with awe. He whispered, "Holy, it's really him." Marissa held her child close, whispering into his ear, "That man, he came for his father." Her voice cracked as emotion swelled. The mechanics crossed their arms, their disdain for Derek thick in their eyes. One muttered, "Well, he's finished now." Nancy set her coffee pot down with a clatter, relief flooding her shoulders. Henry had been right all along. Help had come, not in the form of police, not in the form of neighbors, but in the form of a son whose reach extended far beyond their small town. Michael steps forward. Michael leaned closer to Derek, his voice dropping low enough to cut like ice. "Do you know what it means to strike a veteran? A man who wore the uniform you never earned? Do you know what it means when you humiliate him in public?" Derek swallowed hard, his bluster fading. I didn't. No. I didn't know he was your father." "That's the point," Michael snapped, the steel in his voice rattling Derek further. "Respect isn't something you give because of connections. It's something you give because it's right. And you failed that test miserably." The agents moved closer, their presence a wall of silent authority. The arrest. Derek's hands twitched at his sides, torn between lashing out again and backing down. Pride urged him one way, fear the other. Before he could decide, Michael gave a curt nod. "Take him." The agents moved as one. In seconds, Derek's arms were twisted behind his back, his body slammed lightly against the counter, and cold steel cuffs clicked around his wrists. He struggled, cursing, but his voice broke as the reality of his situation hit him. You can't arrest me. I didn't do anything. He provoked me. Derek shouted, spittle flying, desperation bleeding through every word. Henry finally spoke again, his voice calm as ever. A man reveals who he is when no one's watching. Unfortunately for you, Derek, everyone was watching. Ethan lifted his phone slightly higher, ensuring the camera caught the handcuffs, the look of terror in Derek's eyes, and the unyielding calm of the man he had tried to humiliate. Michael's fury. Michael stepped close enough for Derek to feel his breath. You struck my father. You disgraced a man who sacrificed more for this country than you will ever understand. If you think there won't be consequences, you are gravely mistaken. Derek's knees weakened, his bravado shattered. Please. I didn't know. You didn't need to know, Michael cut in. Decency doesn't ask for introductions. The diner transformed. The patrons no longer sat frozen. Relief mingled with pride. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a bully brought low, not by fists, but by dignity, truth, and the undeniable presence of justice. Nancy whispered to the mechanics, you'll be telling your grandkids about this morning. Marissa hugged her child close, grateful he had seen not just cruelty, but the power of standing firm. Tommy peeked from the kitchen doorway, his wide eyes shining. That's his son, he whispered reverently. That's Mr. Carter's son. Father and son. Michael turned to Henry, his expression softening, though his jaw remained tight with lingering anger. Dad, are you all right? Henry adjusted his cap, his movements slow but steady. I've had worse, he said with a faint smile. Michael's eyes glistened briefly before he turned away, his voice snapping back into authority as he addressed the agents. Get him out of here. Quietly. No more of a scene than he's already made. Derek's protests echoed weakly as he was marched toward the door, his voice drowned out by the clink of the cuffs and the heavy boots of the agents escorting him. The bell jingled once more as the door closed behind them, the sound final, like a gavel striking wood. The aftermath. The diner exhaled collectively. Conversations bubbled up again, hushed but fervent. Patrons spoke to one another, shaking their heads, marveling at what they had just seen. Henry lifted his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it down with a quiet sigh. Michael slid into the stool beside him, resting a hand gently on the counter. You shouldn't have had to endure that, Michael said softly. Henry shook his head. Life doesn't stop testing you, son. Even when you think the battles are behind you. Michael looked at his father, seeing not just a veteran but a man whose strength had never relied on fists or fury. A man whose calm could break louder men apart. Closing scene. The boy Ethan lowered his phone, whispering to his friend, the whole world's gonna see this. And indeed, it was only a matter of time. For now, though, inside Mabel's diner, the storm had passed. The veteran sat steady. The sun stood tall. And the town, shaken and humbled, would never forget the morning when arrogance collapsed in the presence of quiet, enduring strength. The diner's bell still quivered from Derek Malloy's removal, its faint ring swallowed by the thudding silence that followed. Outside, the black SUVs idled, their engines low and ominous. Inside, every patron's gaze flicked between Henry Carter, seated in calm dignity at the counter, and Michael Carter, who stood tall beside his father with the immovable air of command. But it was Derek, cuffed, cornered, and trembling, who felt the weight of the moment the heaviest. Two agents held him firm by the arms near the door, his swagger reduced to frantic stammers. The man who had once strutted into Mabel's diner with arrogance now looked like a child dragged to the principal's office. Michael's authority. Michael stepped forward, his polished shoes tapping against the tiled floor with quiet precision. The air shifted with him. His presence filled the space, not because of volume, but because of controlled power. He had walked into rooms of crisis before, briefings with generals, conferences with world leaders, negotiations where every word was weighed like gold. But never had a room mattered so much as this one, the diner where his father had been humiliated. "Mr. Malloy," Michael began, his tone flat, clipped, the tone of a man used to issuing orders that carried the force of law. "You've crossed a line. And I want you to understand just how far you've crossed it." Derek tried to sneer, but the smirk faltered at the edges. This is crazy. I just got a little rough with an old man. It's not a crime. He mouthed off to me. Michael's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "That old man is my father. A decorated veteran of this nation's wars. A man who carried more on his shoulders than you'll ever comprehend. And you struck him." The words landed like hammer blows, each syllable measured, each pause deliberate. Derek's chest rose and fell rapidly, but his mouth refused to form a reply. The crowd as jury. The patrons of the diner, who had remained silent for so long, now shifted with a new kind of energy. Their eyes bore into Derek with collective condemnation. Nancy, standing behind the counter, finally spoke, her voice sharp, "You didn't just hit him. You disrespected everything he stood for. We all saw it." Joe Ramirez, one of the mechanics, added, "You've been throwing your weight around this town for years, Malloy. But today, you picked the wrong man." Even Marissa, the young mother, chimed in, her child perched on her lap, "My son watched you. You scared him. And he'll remember the way you treated a man who deserved respect." The voices, calm but firm, stacked up like bricks. Derek looked around, eyes darting, searching for an ally. But there was no one left on his side. The evidence. Ethan, the teenager with the phone, stood slowly from his booth. His screen was still lit, the red recording circle glowing. "I got the whole thing," he said, his voice wavering at first, then gaining confidence. "Every word. Every slap. The whole world's gonna see it." Derek's eyes widened, panic flaring. "Delete it. You can't just." Michael cut him off with a raised hand. "The truth doesn't get deleted. It gets seen." He turned to Ethan and nodded once. "You did the right thing, son. Hold on to it." Ethan's chest swelled with pride. In that moment, he wasn't just a bystander, he was part of the reckoning. The strip down. Michael leaned closer to Derek, his voice dropping to a razor's edge. "You want to know the difference between men like you and men like my father? You think power is about fear. You think it's about how loud you can yell, how hard you can hit. But true power, real power, is calm. It's steady. It's earned through sacrifice. And you will never have it." Derek's face flushed red, veins throbbing at his temple. He jerked against the agent's grip, but they held him firm. "You think you're better than me? Just 'cause you wear a fancy suit and got some title in Washington?" Michael's gaze was cold. "I don't need to think it. You've just proven it." Derek breaks. The weight of the room pressed in on Derek. His bravado cracked under the stares, under the truth, under the humiliation of being cuffed like a common criminal. His voice faltered, shrill with desperation. I didn't know he was your dad, okay? If I'd known, I wouldn't have." Henry finally turned from his stool, his calm voice cutting through like thunder. That's the difference, Derek. Respect isn't about who someone's related to. It's about who they are. And if you only give it when you're afraid of their connections, then you never gave it at all. The diner fell silent again, the truth sinking into every corner. Derek sagged against the agent's hold, the fight draining out of him. Michael's sentence. Michael took one step closer, his shadow falling over Derek. His tone shifted, not loud, but sharp, final. Men like you rely on fear. But fear fades. Dignity, honor, respect, those endure. And now, the only thing that endures for you is shame. He nodded to the agents. Take him out. The agents moved, dragging Derek toward the door. His protests were weaker now, scattered curses dissolving into pitiful whines. Please, don't ruin my life over this. It was just a slap. You can't. Michael cut him off with one last look, cold as steel. Your life was already ruined the moment you thought cruelty was strength. The agents hauled Derek out, his shouts muffled by the closing door. The bell chimed once more, the sound final, sealing the chapter. The room exhales. The tension broke like a dam. The patrons let out breaths they didn't know they were holding. Conversations sparked in hushed tones. Did you see that? He didn't even raise his voice. Henry didn't flinch once. Nancy wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. Henry, she said softly, you're something else. Henry tipped his cap, his face calm but his eyes carrying quiet gratitude. Michael remained beside him, his jaw still tight, his fists unclenching only slowly. Father and son. When the whispers quieted, Henry spoke softly to his son. You didn't have to come in person. Michael shook his head. Yes, I did. His voice lowered, filled with both anger and pride. I can't protect this whole country if I can't protect the man who taught me what it means to serve it. For the first time since entering the diner, Michael allowed the mask of command to slip. His hand gripped Henry's shoulder, strong and steady. Henry nodded once. You've done your duty today. More than enough. Closing beat. As the black SUVs outside shifted into gear, the diner slowly returned to life. Plates clinked, conversation stirred, coffee poured again. But nothing felt the same. The patrons had seen a bully unmasked, a son's loyalty displayed, and a veteran's quiet dignity reaffirmed. Henry reached for his coffee again, only to find the cup empty. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Guess I'll need a refill. Nancy hurried over, filling the mug with trembling hands. On the house, Sergeant, she whispered. Michael sat beside his father, his presence still filling the room, though his focus was only on Henry now. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. And Derek Malloy, once loud and untouchable, was gone, dragged away not just by handcuffs, but by the weight of his own disgrace. The bell above the diner door gave its last faint chime as the agents escorted Derek Malloy into the waiting black SUV. The sound was oddly delicate, almost fragile, against the weight of what had just transpired. A hush lingered inside Mabel's diner, like the silence after a storm, the kind of silence when the rain has passed, but the earth hasn't yet figured out how to breathe again. Henry Carter sat at the counter, the same stool where the slap had landed, his cap once more perched proudly on his head. He looked unchanged, yet everything around him had shifted. His cheek bore a faint mark, but his eyes, steady, sharp, calm, glowed with the quiet power of a man who had weathered storms greater than this. Michael Carter sat beside him now, his broad frame dwarfing the stool, his suit sharp and out of place in the small-town diner. He wasn't just a son, he was an anchor, a protector, and a reminder that Henry's years of service had rippled outward in ways no one in this town could have guessed. The diner breathes again. Nancy finally broke the silence. She set a steaming mug of coffee in front of Henry with trembling hands. "On the house, Sergeant," she whispered again, though louder this time, as though reminding everyone what Henry was, and always would be. Henry nodded his thanks, taking the first sip. "Still the best coffee in town," he said. His tone was gentle, but the words carried weight. They pulled the room back into motion. The mechanics, Joe and Kyle, slid back into their booth, their shoulders still tense but their expressions filled with relief. "Man," Joe muttered, shaking his head, "I've seen fights in bars, but that was different." Kyle nodded. "That was justice." At the corner booth, Marissa bounced her toddler on her lap, her voice soft but resolute. "You see, honey. That's what strength really looks like. Not shouting. Not hurting people. Just standing tall." Her child, too young to fully understand, giggled at her tone, but the lesson had already been planted. Ethan, the teenager, lowered his phone but didn't stop recording. His heart pounded with the weight of what he had captured. "The whole world's gonna see this," he whispered again, his voice filled with awe. He didn't know it yet, but his footage would soon carry Henry's quiet dignity beyond the diner's walls, out into living rooms, news broadcasts, and online feeds, a story people would replay again and again. Father and son. Michael leaned closer to his father, lowering his voice. "Dad, you shouldn't have had to endure that." Henry sipped his coffee, set it down carefully, and shrugged with a soldier's stoicism. "Endurance is the story of my life, son. This was nothing compared to the deserts, the jungles, the nights when I thought I wouldn't see home again." Michael's jaw tightened. It was still wrong. "It makes my blood boil knowing anyone would dare." Henry turned, his eyes meeting his son's. "Anger is a weapon, Michael. You carry enough of those already. Don't let it carry you." The lesson, simple but sharp, sank into Michael more deeply than any intelligence briefing ever had. In his world of politics and threats, his father's quiet wisdom was the clearest strategy. The witnesses speak. One by one, the diner's patrons found their voices. Nancy came out from behind the counter, wiping her apron with trembling hands. "Henry, I just want to say, thank you. For everything. For serving, for showing us today what real strength looks like. We'll never forget it." The elderly couple in the corner raised their coffee cups toward him like a toast. "To Henry," the man said. "A gentleman, a soldier, and a hero." Ethan finally stepped forward, clutching his phone. "Mr. Carter, sir. I hope it's okay that I recorded everything. People need to see it. They need to see that not everyone backs down to bullies." Henry gave the boy a faint smile. "You did right, son. The truth is always worth recording." The words lit a fire in Ethan's chest. For the first time in his young life, he felt like his actions mattered. The moral gavel. Michael stood, his voice carrying through the room now, calm but commanding. "What happened here today wasn't just about my father. It was about every man and woman who serves quietly, who asks for nothing, who endures more than most of us will ever know. When you strike someone like that, you strike at the dignity of all who gave more than they received." He looked at each patron in turn, his eyes sharp. "But I'm proud to say this, you all stood witness. You didn't look away. That matters. The room seemed to sit up straighter under his words. The mechanics nodded firmly. Nancy blinked back tears. Marissa whispered to her child again. Even Tommy, the dishwasher, leaned against the kitchen doorway with pride shining in his eyes. Henry's final lesson. Henry lifted his mug again, sipping slowly, before speaking. His words were quiet, but everyone strained to hear. Respect is earned in silence, in deeds, in how you carry yourself when no one's looking. Today, that boy thought he could take it from me with his hand. But respect isn't something that can be slapped away. It stays. It endures. And it always comes back to light. The room fell still, the truth of it hanging in the air like scripture. Michael looked at his father with new eyes, realizing that even as Director of Homeland Security, with power and reach stretching across the nation, there were still lessons only this old man in a small-town diner could teach him. Leaving the diner. Outside, the SUVs idled, waiting. Michael checked his watch, his duty calling him back to Washington, back to the machinery of government in crisis. But for this moment, he lingered. He placed a firm hand on Henry's shoulder. Take care of yourself, Dad. Call me sooner next time. Henry chuckled softly. You came when it mattered. That's enough. Michael leaned in, his voice low. I'll make sure this doesn't get buried. Men like Derek Malloy don't get to walk away anymore. Not when the world is watching. Henry nodded once. Do it for them. Not for me. Michael understood. His father didn't seek vengeance. He sought legacy. With a final nod to the patrons, Michael and his team stepped outside, the door closing behind them, the bell chiming one last time. The SUVs pulled away, their engines fading into the distance. Legacy of respect. The diner slowly resumed its rhythm. Coffee poured. Plates clinked. Conversations stirred. But everything felt changed. Nancy moved with a lighter step, glancing at Henry with newfound admiration. The mechanics debated baseball again, but with softer tones, still shaken by the morning. Marissa kissed her child's forehead, silently thankful he had witnessed dignity triumph over cruelty. Ethan uploaded his video with trembling fingers, the caption simple, "This is what respect looks like." And Henry? He sat at the counter, sipping his coffee, staring out the window as the town carried on. His cheek still bore the faint mark of Derek's slap, but it wasn't a wound. It was a badge. Because in that diner, on that morning, Henry Carter had reminded everyone, respect isn't given out of fear, or demanded with force. It's lived. It's endured. It's carried quietly, so that when the moment comes, it cannot be taken away. Closing scene. The sun climbed higher, spilling golden light across the diner's floor. Henry placed his cap firmly back on his head, straightened his shoulders, and stood with slow dignity. Time to go, he murmured. Nancy watched him walk toward the door, cane tapping against the tile, his frame still proud. And as he stepped into the daylight, the witnesses of Mabel's diner knew they hadn't just seen a fight. They had seen a lesson, one that would echo long after the SUVs, the bully, and the morning itself were gone. Henry Carter's legacy was clear. Not fear. Not power. Respect.